Your life must flow. It's great to learn, 'cause knowledge is power. The Schoolhouse Rocket, the chip of the map on your favorite Schoolhouse Rock.
All right, and with that, thank you everyone for joining us for this afternoon special session of CME Palooza Spring. This session is called, and I'll bring it up here in just one second, Grant Request Rock. And our moderator today is Kate Biles. Kate is the Associate Director of Scientific Education at Bristol Myers Squibb. And I do have to say that when we invite our moderators for our CME Palooza sessions, usually people are pretty excited that they've been invited and are usually happy to take it on. Kate was the most excited moderator in the history of CME Palooza. She loved Schoolhouse Rock, so she was very excited to be moderating this session. So as with all of our CME Palooza sessions, we start by doing the important work of thanking all of our sponsors, our gold sponsors, Daiichi Sankyo, Academic CME, Physicians Education Resource, our silver sponsors, Peer Audience, Clinical Care Options and Practicing Clinicians Exchange, Medscape Education, as well as our bronze sponsors, PVI, Catalyst Medical Education, CMEology, Academy for Continued Healthcare Learning, Vindico Medical Education, Paradigm Medical Communications, Postgraduate Institute for Medicine, Global Education Group, CE Outcomes, Integrity CE, RMEI, Helio CME, Infograph Ed, Med Learning Group, Primary Care Network, Prova Education, and Red Med Ed. So there are two ways to ask questions during this and all of our CME Palooza sessions. You can use the Peer Audience text line to send in a question to 267-6660-CME, that's 0263. Or you could tweet your question to us using the CME Palooza hashtag. So we will be using Poll Everywhere for this session. So for anyone who is interested in interacting with our audience response questions during this presentation, you can either download the Poll Everywhere app and join the presentation entitled CME Palooza 000, or type in the following URL in a web browser, www.pollev.com/CME Palooza 000. So I think we've got about 5 questions that we'll be asking throughout this session today. So finally, our speaker disclosure, please note that the opinions, discussions, and/or conclusions expressed are those of our panelists and do not represent an endorsement by or position of their employer, parent company, or their affiliates. So that I am going to turn this over to Kate to get us started.
Thank you, Scott. Before I introduce my panelists, I do want to say, yes, Scott's right. I was extremely excited. I am a huge fan of Schoolhouse Rock. I want to share with you my DVD of the 30th anniversary edition that my son and I constantly watch. And for you parents and moms and dads at home, I'm sorry, hold on one second. You moms and dads at home who are trying to help homeschool your child, this is a huge addition to assisting with learning about grammar, history, social studies, science. I learned so much as a child, and I still learn every day when we watch it. So moving on to important matters. My panel is made up of 2 people within the industry that many of us already know very well, Anne-Marie DiMatteo, who works at Regeneron, and Antonio Mio, who works at Synovion. And our session today is broken up into 3 segments based on the Schoolhouse Rock theme. The first is going to be with Anne-Marie. It's called I'm Just a Grant Request, which is, of course, a spinoff of I'm Just a Bill. Yes, I'm Only a Bill. We all know the song. And we're going to follow the progress of a grant proposal from initial request to approval to recon and see just how it travels once a requester proposes the grant. So for you, Anne-Marie, to start off with, what is the first line of review of a grant? Does it come through you? Does it come through like a compliance or legal team first? How does that work at Regeneron?
So for us, it comes through our grant portal, and the first person to take a look at it and determine whether or not it's ready to move on is our grant administrators. So they are the very first line of defense, so to speak.
Okay. And then, Antonio, what about you? Is it the same setup there at Synovian?
Similar. So our coordinator, which is me, reviews the entire grant submission to make sure everything is included that we typically look for a complete review.
Okay, and I can speak for Celgene and for BMS. With Celgene, it would come through our portal, and I would be the initial reviewer for content and compliance and so forth, and then it would eventually go to a GRC to voters and then to GRC. For BMS, we have a corporate grants and giving group that is the initial receiver of all grants, including non-CME grants. And they vet the grant for various things, budget, compliance, other compliance issues, and make sure that it's appropriate before sending it along to the grant IME specialists or the grant managers or me to start reviewing the grants for content and alignment with strategy and so forth. So in that vein, Anne Marie, at the first receipt of the grant, what are you looking for when you first are looking at the grant?
So the grant administrator initially is looking for, one, believe it or not, that the grant is actually complete, which is sometimes shocking how many come in and are not complete, that all of the questions aren't answered or certain budget items are missing or whatnot. So first and foremost, well, let me backtrack a little bit. First and foremost, they make sure that it's an area that's aligned with our areas of interest. Because as we all know, and I was on the provider side for 5 billion years before being on the pharma side, I used to do this too, but sometimes you try to squeeze in maybe something that you think they might have an interest in, but it's not exactly the area. So the very first thing is it an area that we have an interest in and that we have funding in? And then it's for the initial review is completeness. So is everything that we need to move it on to our IME strategist or our grant review committee? Is everything there? Are there any obvious questions that we know just from working with our grant review committees? We kind of know what questions they're going to ask and what their themes are or things that are their hot topics. Are those covered in the grant, or do we need to call up the applicant prior to presenting it to the GRC to have a more complete proposal to review with them?
Okay, and Antonio, what about you?
Similar to what's been said already. So our initial review that takes place is making sure we have all the supporting documents that we request and that we typically present to the committee for review, looking for just general completeness and what's being responded to. Does it make sense? Is it complete sentences? Are they full thoughts? Do we have all the information that is needed to effectively communicate the entire proposal from beginning to end to the committee so that they have a good, clear picture of what's being presented. And additionally, for our organization, does it make sense? Is it something that's aligned with therapeutic areas, objectives, just a general scrubbing of the initial grant proposal in its complete form.
Okay. And Anne-Marie, you referenced GRC. Can you explain your process in terms of once you review it, how it goes to GRC and what happens there?
Absolutely. So our GRC, everyone's is kind of made up of different people, but we have our required voters, and then we may ask additional people for, information or to better align with our strategies or, whatever their expertise is that we might need in helping to evaluate the grant. Those are considered our non-voting reviewers. But our GRC is made up of the therapeutic area IME lead, our grant administrator, of course, representing the therapeutic area. Then we have medical affairs director as a required voter. Our legal is compliance representative is a required voter, and our finance team is a required voter. So once we have a grant where we feel that it is ready to make a recommendation, so a little backtrack. So once we have a complete proposal, then we look at it from a strategy point of view. How does it fall into our medical education plan? Is it checking off, every year when we do our medical education plans? We know, we want to do, we want a regional approach. We want to make sure we're covering this, we're covering that, depending upon where we are in terms of support and the molecule life cycle. What is our focus for the year? How are we aligning with our interests? How are we also complementing and perhaps broadening our company's reach overall? So we're looking to not always double dip with what other areas of supporting. As everybody knows, medical education is not the only support that we give to outside organizations, nor is it the only educational support we give. So we want to do our due diligence, and this might be where a non-voter is asked to chime into a GRC meeting. Are they supporting something similar? Are we double dipping with our funds? How can we make sure that we're aligned and complementing one another? So once we know that we aren't double dipping, we have the conversations with the GRCs, we defend, it's our job to present your proposal. So going back to how complete the application is very important, because you're not sitting in those meetings, right? You're not in those conversations where you can just readily answer a question. So you have to present the applications as hard, and believe me, I know how hard it is, as hard as it is, as thorough as possible, so we can then do that. So those are the types of conversations that happen in our GRC. Like I said, we always try on our side to make a recommendation to the committee. So we've thought about it with our IME team first. We've asked questions with other functional areas to find out where this might fit into overall plans. And then when we present in the GRC, we hope that obviously all of the members have read the grant, but then we have a discussion about it, and IME makes a recommendation as to where they think it might fall within the medical education plan, why we think it's a good idea, what RMIs might we have, and those kind of discussions commence from there.
Okay. So once a grant is approved, assuming, after GRC, you have a lot of grants that are approved, do you require updates from the providers in your grant portal? Do you get them via email or both? Like, what happens to the grant after it's approved?
So yes, once a grant is approved, we do have a series, we probably have very strict requirements from the grant recipient. So we do ask for quarterly status reports during the development of whatever the curriculum, program, educational plan is. And why we do that is twofold. We're not in any way, of course, trying to influence, but we do want to know that there is actions happening. Again, surprisingly, sometimes once a grant's approved, it kind of sits somewhere for a while. And I think I've only been doing this for a few years now, but there have been times where we've had grants that have sat for a year without anything happening with it. So our status reports are just that, just how are you doing? Is there some top level information that you can give us, just to let us know that you're working on the development, it's progressing, and you're going to meet your, the proposed dates. I think this is a good point to say that in those quarterly status reports, and those are very informal, but in those status reports, if there's going to be a date change for whatever reason, and it could be, a couple of weeks, it could be a couple of months, and very legitimate reasons, it is extremely important during that time frame that you're letting us know, because those changes of dates, even though they seem very minimal, will then impact everything else that we require from that grant, which includes when outcomes reports are due, when your closeout and reconciliation is due. So it's very important to keep us up to date on those changes. Once an activity has launched, we then ask that you send us, notification that whether it's an invitation or whatever it might be, the activity is live or it was presented at such and such a meeting. Then it's kind of starts the clock on outcomes reporting. And we do ask for quarterly outcomes reporting as well as the overall final report. Obviously, they don't have to, there can be varying levels of what you're giving us. As everybody knows, we do ask that you use our an educational impact summary approach to your outcomes reporting. I think everyone's pretty much aware of what that is for our organization, but if not, let us know and we'll have one-on-one conversations with you to review that. And then the always, close out, right? The confirmation, the final outcomes, the reconciliation, and then a return of any unused funds. So I think we might be a little bit more strict with the number of reports and that we're very adamant about when we receive them. But I think hopefully, Antonio, I don't know, you let me know, but I think most of us kind of require the same thing, just in different ways.
Yeah, I can definitely speak for us. We do have very similar setup where we want frequent updates as to the progress of the grant once it's been initiated, and then certainly outcome updates and final outcomes. Antonio, can you share a little bit about the process based on what some of the things that Anne Marie spoke about at Synovion?
Absolutely. So there's definitely some overlap in terms of once it's made it through that initial review within our medical education team, identifying it meets the objectives that we've set internally. It's checking off the boxes within medical affairs, meetings that we would like to be at, and association congress annual meetings. Is it fitting within the need? It then goes to our grants review team, we call it, which is the initial first step, which is comprised of the medical director within medical affairs and some other members within scientific communications. We have some committees that have medical science liaisons who participate in reviewing. So that grant review team has the ability to approve grants up to a certain dollar threshold. So if it's within that dollar threshold, they approve of it. It'll then get looked at by our legal compliance and finance team to make sure it kind of fits within our overall strategy with our organization as a whole. Anything above that certain dollar threshold then has to go to a larger or a next step committee. We call it the grant review committee here at Synovion, and that includes our head of clinical development and our head of global medical affairs, just to make sure as we cross a certain dollar threshold, it really the education that we're supporting aligns with our organization's overall strategy for the year in general. One thing of note, as Anne-Marie had pointed out, as medical education, we are kind of bringing this grant forward to the committee to take a look at. So anything that's made it this far has everything that we require. It answers all the questions. It's something that our medical education team supports and believes fits the needs that we're looking for, has good content, program development. It kind of checks all of our boxes. So while I'm not a voting member in either committee, I am part of the recommendation of that grant. So after we get the final checkoff from the committees, from legal compliance and finance, the letter of agreement is executed. That starts our timelines as well. So most of the communication for us is then conducted outside of our online request management system. We do require quarterly updates, letting us know how the programs are being developed, your timelines. And as Anne-Marie had pointed out, it's important for these updates to be regular and be as complete as possible for two reasons. One, those start and end dates triggers also our process for reconciliation and grant closeout. So if you have multiple reconciliations that are pending, you will not be able to submit new grants until you kind of close up some of the older grants. So that's one important note. But additionally, for our organization, we're looking at certain programs and when they're launching to fill gaps for us. So it's okay if programs are delayed a certain amount of time with legitimate reasons behind that. But if we're not being kept up to date on the launch of those programs, it'll throw off our timelines of trying to fill in the gaps and make sure where we have constant new education in different therapeutic areas launching over time. So those updates are important. We don't have a typical structure. Just checking in with us is necessary for us to follow up with you.
Okay. And Anne-Marie, before we move on to the next section, I just had one final question. When you talk about outcomes, when you do get the outcomes, how do you use them? Do you share them internally? And if you do, who do you share them with?
Yes, we do share them internally. We find, our goal, and I think this is, I can say pretty fairly across all of the supporter roles, is that those outcomes help us show our impact, right? Each of us is getting millions of dollars a year to spend to support education. And as in any good business, not that we can show a return on investment, but what we can show is how impactful those investments were in terms of educating and potentially changing the clinical behavior of our audiences with these new discoveries and advances in medicine, whatever those might be, whether they're just better knowledge of the disease, better diagnostic tools, new and innovative diagnostic tools that might help with earlier diagnosis, recognition and diagnosis, guidelines, right? New guidelines. It's our job to make sure everyone's aware of those as well. And then, of course, the treatments and how are we helping these patients the most. So the outcomes reports, the impact summaries are how we do that. So we do take them very seriously. We will make lots of inquiries about what you present, regardless of how fabulous it is that you present it, because we're so inquisitive and want to know everything. And what we do is not only do we share that with our grant review committee, but more importantly, we try to share it with our entire medical affairs team in that therapeutic area for that disease state, as well as with our other interests in those areas. So they can be shown to clinical, they can be shown to our discovery and research team, depending upon what it is. If we find a new need that we think would be of interest to them, we share it with them, and we share it with our commercial team as well, because they need to be aware of some of these issues as well, in terms of ongoing needs, things that people just aren't getting, or barriers that we might be unaware of as a team.
Great. Antonio, how about you? Do you share your outcomes internally? I know we do.
We do. So similar to Anne-Marie, what we have, most of our therapeutic areas have monthly, if not more often, team meetings within medical affairs. So interim reportings and final outcomes do get shared during these meetings. But importantly, sharing more so than just with the medical affairs, sharing with our medical science liaison colleagues, seeing if the needs and gaps that are persistent after programs are still real world needs and gaps, comparing notes with any kind of field-based team members is important, just to see if we're all kind of aligning there. We do a lot of year-end reporting within the organization, so sharing the outcomes, gaps that were potentially closed or we're making progress on. A lot of our teams are interested in seeing that, and any kind of new need or gap that's been identified to see if we can help educate there within medical affairs and medical education, or if it's something that needs to be handed off to somebody else to kind of start taking a look at to see how we close those gaps. So we do often and on certain levels, and then depending on the availability, we share it when we can, and depending on how deep we go.
Great.
So I've got
So
one.
Scott,
Yeah, I've got
Um,
one question that came in that I think is going to be good to kind of ask now. So this came over our peer audience text line. So approximately what percentage of grant requests make it through that initial phase of review and actually make it to a larger grant review committee?
Anne Marie, do you want to answer this one?
Sure. I would say it's very few that don't make it to committee. I would say the vast majority, because even if our recommendation from IME is to decline, we always want to talk about why. Maybe it's just not the appropriate time. Maybe it's just the quality of the request, in which case we'll say that. Maybe it's a past experience we had with that applicant, and we'll say that. So we kind of tend to bring a lot to committee. Even if we're recommending decline, we won't necessarily ask them to do as in-depth of a review, but we do want to let them know why we're doing this. The ones that don't make it to committee ever are if they're not in the area of interest that they've applied to, if we have no money left, obviously,
Right.
or if it's just, oftentimes, and I don't know if you all have this issue as well, it just isn't an IME request, right? Maybe it was a sponsorship request that made it into our system somehow, or something that might be more appropriate for a patient advocacy team, or study, right? Those are the ones that we just don't even bring to committee.
Right. That makes sense. So Scott, I think we're ready for our ARS question for this segment.
Okay, hold on one second. Some people have already started responding to this, which is fine, but you can read the question.
Given the current COVID-19 pandemic, how do you see educational planning and grant considerations changing in regard to live meeting support moving forward? And it looks like most of the people answered it's too soon to know with any certainty. Am I right in saying that?
Looks like 100% of people answered that.
There you go.
Now we're getting a few more time again.
I can certainly say things are changing by the minute where we're coming from. I was talking to Antonio before we started, and I feel like it's been busier now than ever just because of the number of changes of scope that we're getting, because things that were live are now going virtual. So I certainly think it's hard to say now, but it'll be interesting to see how things change when we do get back to a little more normalcy and things like live congresses need to be addressed, whether they're going to become virtual. And if you can do ASCO virtually, I think you can pretty much do anything virtually. So it will be interesting to see. Obviously, we see the answers are changing now that more people have had a chance to weigh in. So some plan to submit fewer live meeting support requests, others more live. Some don't plan to make any changes. So I think really the majority, it's too soon to know, but it'll be interesting maybe next CME Palooza or next meeting there where we all come together to talk about these kinds of issues and how CME is going to change as a result of this pandemic. Moving on to the next segment, we are going to go into Lolly, 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 get your funding here. I don't know if you all remember Lolly, 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 get your adverbs here. That was a tough one for me. I always had trouble with the adverbs. Anyway, this segment focuses on the financial issues of grant departments. So I'm going to start off and talk about my experience in terms of how things work in terms of funding. And then I'll ask Antonio and Anne Marie to give their perspectives. So the first question was, when is the best time to submit grant requests? And who determines what funding will be available from year to year? In my experience, I would say the best time to submit grant requests is obviously the beginning of the year, because that is when we have the most money. And you will notice as a supporter that you receive a lot of grant requests in December, January, February, because people are really scrambling to try to get, things funded. So that's understandable. Obviously, at the end of the year, we're going to have less money to fund bigger programs, sometimes no money at all left over towards the later months of the year. So, but that doesn't mean we don't put funding on hold. You know, we all have plans. We don't just start off a year with a budget and just sort of throw it at the wall. We all have a plan, a strategic plan that we develop before the next year. And in that plan, there are things like Congress support we definitely want to do, satellite support, regional community programs, certainly online enduring media. That's going to become a big portion of what we do, I think. So there is budget reserved for these kinds of things that is available when those things come up. So for example, I do hematology, so ASH happens in December. Although their application process is much sooner in the year, but we're just now going over ASH proposals. So we've had to all reserve funding for the ASH satellites that we want to support. Hopefully they'll be held live this year. It's being held in San Diego in December. But so yeah, it depends on who you ask, but certainly the beginning of the year is when we have more funding. Obviously the end of the year is when we have less. And who determines what funding will be available for us? Our budgets are determined by our strategy. Like I said, we all have a plan. We start developing our plan usually the summer before the next year. We base our plan on needs assessment and gap analysis. We base our plan on the life cycle of the products that we're supporting education in. We base our plan on previous year's spend. Or if we have a launch product or a product that's about to launch, we base our spend on that. So there's a lot of factors that go into it. Our funding comes from medical affairs, which we fall under. The Celgene Legacy team, anyway, that's how it worked. Anne Marie, is it similar for you?
Mm-hmm. Very similar. So I will say our calendar year is January to December. We usually open, or our portal is still open at the end of each year in case people want to be the early birds. But we probably start really looking at grants the end of January with our GRC. And again, you know, the earlier the better, because what we're hoping for, unless there's something earmarked that's a series, or you know, because an association might require, you know, a space selection or saving space application, you know, 6 months in advance. We do try as best as we can to make sure that the education is going to launch within that same calendar year. So earlier for us is better, January to December. Same with us, we fall under medical affairs. So medical affairs leads are determining our budget. And also same, we start our planning the summer before. We always ask for a ton more than what we actually get. That's where those outcomes reports are so important.
Right.
Yeah, and then same thing. Where are we in the life cycle? What are other functional areas supporting? How are we aligning with all of the other outward-facing tactics? Where, you know, is there some new innovation that we want to make sure that we're supporting? Innovation is one of those words that you never quite know what it means, but is there some new learning format or something really cool or a new meeting that we want to make sure we're a part of? That all falls into it.
And what about you, Antonio?
Yeah, so I think the biggest difference, the highlight for us then, is our fiscal calendar is April 1 to March 31. So we're one of the I know there's other supporters out there that kind of follow this. So so we operate very similar in terms of review, but it's almost backwards for us. So with our start of our fiscal year, we're really looking at autumn and winter programs first of that calendar year. So for this year, it'd be 2020. And then within the remaining of our budget, we're looking at programs in the winter, spring of 2021. So we do set buckets aside for, you know, association meetings that we've kind of targeted. We set some a benchmark for online program that we would like to fund, just using prior years and the types of education we're looking to support. And then similarly, my budget is within medical affairs. So our planning starts in the autumn, probably around October timeframe. So working with our medical director who owns the entire medical affairs budget, we work with them to request dollars that we're looking for the new fiscal year based on our targeted objectives, targeted meetings within medical affairs, life cycle management, and our wish list of everything that we would want. And then,
Okay.
either get scaled back or up depending on availability.
Right. I can speak just for me. I mean, it's April now, and 2 of my therapeutic areas are nearly out of funding, and it's not really, there's no rhyme or reason to it other than the fact that we've funded just about everything we want to fund and had planned to fund. We've covered all the target audiences we wanted to cover. So unless something really, really key comes along, we may go back to Med Affairs and say, are you interested in funding this? But, many times at Celgene, we had a website where we would post, if there was limited funding available, so that there wasn't a huge amount of proposals coming in those areas where there wasn't a lot of funding to put out there. So that's another way of kind of managing the budget and the funding. So Scott, were there any questions from the audience?
Yep. So a couple questions that came in on the peer audience text line. So given the financial disruption from the COVID-19 pandemic, some companies are sending out notices that educational grants will not be reviewed for a while. First of all, is that happening with any of you guys? And what should CME providers do when needing to apply for grants for future activities that are still scheduled for the fall? By that, I assume they mean probably live conferences that are going to be in October, November, December.
For BMS, we have not, as far as I understand it, issued any information about not reviewing grants. We're still reviewing grants as they come in. I'm reviewing my grants on a regular basis. Obviously now with so many live meetings that we had supported for things like regional conferences, large annual conferences like ASCO, ONS, going virtual, there have been a lot of changes of scope coming in. And that's certainly what a lot of providers, I think, are really focusing on right now, is getting their changes of scope back to us so that we can decide whether we want to go forward and continue with the program if there's a contingency plan to go virtual or use another method to educate the audience. I don't know, Anne Marie, Antonio, does your company have any issue with still reviewing grants as they're coming in now after COVID?
No, oops.
Go ahead.
We're still reviewing grants. I think to answer the fall or late or winter, early winter conferences, what we're asking everybody is to, if you haven't submitted the grants already, make sure you're providing a contingency plan within the grant, fully realizing that you may not know what that might be, what the association or conference organizer is going to offer to you. But we do at least want to know that you have that realistic point of view that they may not happen. And something we want or encouraging people to think about and that we're thinking about is, even if these events do happen in the fall, how successful are they going to be? Are people going to be willing to travel? Are they going to be able to take off of work? With just the absolute disruption that's occurring right now, is it even feasible to think that they're going to want to be in these mass, environments with all different types of people in close proximity, in a meeting room where you're rubbing shoulders with people? So we're really thinking about that at the Regeneron side. We don't know the answer. It's conversations we have with our larger groups. And it's just, conference support tends to be expensive. And is that the best use of our money when people are truly being innovative now in virtual alternatives? So we don't know the answer. We're thinking about it as everyone else is. I would just encourage everyone, if you are still submitting for live, you know, we will come back and say, what is your contingency plan if that doesn't happen? At least let us know you're starting to think about something.
Right. That's a great point. And what about you, Antonio?
Yeah, very similar. So because our fiscal year just started 14 days ago, we haven't had to delay grant reviews. We typically don't start, until the end of April, beginning of May timeframe anyway. So that's not going to be impacted. But similar to Anne-Marie, any grants that have been submitted, we are offering the chance to issue an RFI for programs later in the autumn, winter months to already proactively submit a change of scope or contingency plan as part of that grant. And any new grants, we're requesting that as well, with the understanding that it may shift, but we want to see, and we know it's asking a lot, but we'd like to see option A, everything goes back to normal, everyone's attending meetings, great. And then option B is if we're unsure about what the landscape of everything's going to be in the autumn and winter, and if that contingency plan needs to actually be implemented, we need some structure. We'd like to see some structure, or at least a plan in place.
Yeah, I completely agree. Those are great ideas, and I think that's something we're also looking at, making sure that in the future too, as we get proposals coming in, new proposals, that they all offer a contingency plan, because again, we don't know how things are going to go for the remainder of the year and moving forward. So Scott, are there any other questions, or should we ask our polling question?
Yeah, I think we got about 15 minutes left, so let's move on to the next polling question here.
So does any other group outside of medical affairs determine your funding for the year? Choose all that apply. A is yes, commercial. B is yes, legal. C is yes, another group is involved. And D is no, just medical affairs. Wow. Very interesting. It kind of runs the gamut. Very interesting. I think in our case, just for the three of us, it's medical affairs is the answer, but it differs for many companies. So
maybe next time we'll ask this question with sort of an open text field, so people can tell us what the
other is exactly.
Okay, we'll move on to the next one.
Okay, so the next one is, what do you do when you're running out of money in a therapeutic area? Choose all that apply. A, we ask for more money from medical affairs or another group. B, we revise our plan for the next year to ask for more money in that area. C, we spend strategically until the budget is spent. Or D, we post on our website that there's limited funding available. Again, a little bit from everywhere. Yeah, that's not unusual. I think all of those answers are kind of right, depending upon the circumstance.
Okay.
So let's go on to the next section, which is Antonio's My Hero Zero funding. Well, spin-off of My Hero Zero. So this segment is going to look at things that disqualify or may be frowned upon for grant proposals, basically kind of the red flags that supporters see when a grant is submitted. So Antonio, what issues for you would disqualify a grant from being supported at Synovian?
Sure. So a lot of outside of ACCME standards, obviously some of this is opinionated. So I actually went back to some of the archived sessions to see if we can drum up some other examples. I succeeded in a few, but some may sound repeated over the time. So as we discussed earlier, all of the grants that we receive run through a quick search with appropriate organizations and authorities and against our internal exclusion list. So if any accreditor, program provider, educational partner is picked up in any of these searches for any reason, even if the organization is working through it, at that time they would automatically be disqualified. If it's something that's just paperwork, or you're working with accreditation to continue your accreditation, for example, as that gets resolved, future grants will be reviewed, but at that time it'll be an automatic disqualification. Additionally, again, as we talked about, we get a lot of grant requests. Some are not medical education. Some are not within our therapeutic areas, or they were therapeutic areas that we were funding in prior years. So if it doesn't immediately match up at this time, that would be a disqualification. And another example that we have very specific to our organization is, while meals at CME are exempted from sunshine reporting, our organization put in additional guardrails specific to around dollars per meal and or number of attendees at the session. So it's not an immediate disqualification, because at that point we would open up an RFI, explain to you the additional guardrails that we have. If you're able and willing to comply and amend your budget, then we would be able to review that grant. If you're not willing or just can't because of the pricing of where you're at, then it would be a disqualification at that time.
Okay. Can you offer some red flags when reviewing your grants that would make you question approving a grant, Antonio?
For sure. So initially, any poorly written or executed grant proposal in general kind of raises a flag immediately for us. Our online request management system has certain fields that we require to be filled out, and that's really used as our highlight, our snapshot of the entire grant. So if this is done in like a quick way, or just avoid it altogether, it doesn't present a great picture for us in terms of what the program could look like as you're running it. Additionally, if you're not submitting all of the documentation that we require, it sends a signal either you don't have the resources to complete a full proposal, or you're rushing through it, or just trying to get funding some way. So you're doing the bare minimum. So that definitely raises a flag for us. Another example, I wasn't quite sure where to put it in our topic. I thought appropriate red flag at the end of the day. I think for us, overestimating the learner target numbers in hopes of swaying an opinion one way or the other is definitely a red flag, and definitely not appropriate. We do look at anticipated learner numbers, anticipated number of certificates. What does that equate to cost per learner? We look at that, one, in terms of if we get multiple grants at a live association congress, for example, and we have multiple sitting in front of us, we can see and compare grant to grant. We know a lot of the online learning platforms, the guarantees that they offer, the typical program, historical program perspectives that they offer. So we take all of that into account. And while we encourage you to have a reach for new learners, we want to see that you're doing it appropriately and thoughtfully. So in addition to a high number of learners, your audience generation really needs to lay that out as to why you think you're going to successfully be able to reach that target. If it appears too good to be true, it very well could just be passed up on and be a decline. And I say it's a red flag because I think worst case is, other than not getting the approval, is if the grant does get approved, and at the time when the outcomes are reported and that program falls short of, or extremely short of, the anticipated learners, and there's not a very good explanation as to why that is, the automatic assumption is that the numbers were inflated to either drive down cost per learner or to give a competitive edge in that grant. So definitely be aware. We want to see you try for bigger numbers, but we want to make sure it's being done appropriately and realistically.
Right. Okay, so those are really some good answers to kind of what a bad grant looks like. Anne Marie, what does a bad grant look like in your eyes?
I think everything Antonio said is right on for us as well. You know, the quality of the proposal, the past, level of execution and, past grants that you've received. Is the application realistic? It's shocking how many are not. Promising the world when we know, that's probably not going to happen. And quite honestly, for everyone to think about, we don't want the world, that's kind of going on what Antonio said. One of our things that we're looking at is don't throw in everybody and the kitchen sink. If you're proposing specialist education, why are you adding primary care and nurses and pharmacists, right? They're going to skew your outcomes because your education you're proposing is for a specific level of education and experience, right? Day-to-day experience. So if you are going to do something like that, why? Are you doing a cohort analysis by specialty and or profession? Or, are you're not really understanding what we're trying to support, which is how we take that. If you have conversations with us, you kind of know. And if you have conversations with us about just some of our general guiding principles, which again, completely compliant, nothing that we wouldn't put in an RFP that was publicly available, and then you submit something that's exactly the opposite of what we know, or that was in an RFP, even worse, it kind of makes us scratch our head and wonder, it probably isn't something we're going to support. And as Antonio said, oftentimes, especially with live meetings, we have multiple requests for the same type of initiative. So then now your request is being compared apples to apples, where those types of things that Antonio brought up and your understanding of our overall strategy come into play. And when it's on its own, maybe it's okay. But when you're comparing it with 4 or 5 others, it sticks out a lot more.
Right.
So I would think those are some additions.
Right. So moving to the other side of the coin, Antonio, what does a good grant look like for you?
Just avoid the red flags and bad grants that we talked about, and you should be okay.
I think we said not to.
I think, again, this is my opinion, and I have not been doing this for a very long time, and over the years that I have been doing it, I look at a grant proposal as a story, and how is it kind of laid out in terms of, you have your letter of request as the introduction, your needs assessment, your objectives. It's all rounded out by the educational design and how it's going to be presented. And then eventually, if the grant's approved, the outcomes kind of is the conclusion and postscript to all of that. But I think for us, I wanted to call out specifically, your needs assessment and your objectives should really be anchored to each other. Needs assessment is something that our committees do look at in detail, but we're not looking for disease state, therapeutic area knowledge alone. So citing statistics, ongoing or completed trials, current or emerging therapies, that's all great, but we want to see the specific gaps that you're identifying for this type of program, for this audience, and the objectives that are specifically tied to that. So almost, we've seen buckets where it's need or gap that's identified, the objective that's going to be tied to it, and the learning component within the program. And it kind of makes a nice flow from one to the other. And it makes sense. It's not just a needs assessment, objectives, and then a educational design part of that. And then another part that I think is really important is when you're talking about the program development, educational design, we within medical education have a lot of learning, the capabilities calls with providers, and we've seen a lot of it when we're going to a larger committee who doesn't live and breathe medical education and educational platforms and new technologies that are coming up. It's important to have as many examples and resources that we can share with them to clearly explain the type of education and the type of platform that's going to be utilized. If you're relying solely on me to kind of really explain this for you without having prior program examples, or if it's something new, a demonstration, a quick video, charts, graphs, anything that'll help us and the committee clearly understand what you're trying to do, that's super helpful for us.
Yeah, I think that's a really great overview of the types of things we want to see in a grant proposal. So, Scott, do we have any questions before we launch into our polling questions?
So we do, but unfortunately we're out of time. So we're
Okay.
we're right at 2:54. So we try to get this wrapped up. I know that we could probably talk about a lot of these issues, and we do have some questions that came in. So I apologize for people who submitted questions that we weren't able to get to. But
you can submit them to me, Scott, and I'll try to answer them for anyone who has questions.
Sure. So before we do wrap this up, I do want to remind everyone that there's a brief survey at the top of the live tab. So if people can try to complete that, it'll take you about 30 seconds. It does help us plan for the future. And for those people who are watching the live version of this session, our next session is going to start here in about 5 minutes. It's the return of Jake Powers, CME detective. So certainly a session you do not want to miss. So that will begin shortly. So with that, I would like to thank Kate and Antonio and Anne-Marie, and to everybody watching this session. Have a safe and good afternoon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care.